I have done numerous guides on how to calibrate your display, and in all of those guides, I focus on one singular device. In the real world scenario that we live in, many times we would have our device hook up to an external display, and sometimes these external display are capable of hardware calibration, sometimes they are not. In this situation, how do we then go about and calibrate these multiple displays? Or for instance, if you have a desktop computer and if you decide to hook up multiple displays to it, how do you then go and calibrate it, especially if one of them or some of them are hardware calibration capable and some are not? In this video, I'm going to talk you through which software set you would use to calibrate those displays, some of the settings you may consider using, challenges that you'll be running into, and we're also going to talk about the color specs in general of these displays and which display should you use to do your color critical work on. I'm Mark Swansang, BenQ Ambassador. Let's get started. Before we start, please subscribe if you're new and hit on the notification bell so you'll be updated every time I upload cool new videos like this. So I'm going to give you a few scenarios in this video, but primarily I'm going to start out with this scenario that I have set in front of me. I have a MacBook Pro here. However, in place of this MacBook Pro, this can be an iMac Pro, all-in-one desktop PC, or a laptop PC for that matter. And with me, I have BenQ SW271. This is their 27-inch 4K hardware calibrated display. So because I already mentioned hardware calibrated display, many of us are now having the feeling that we're going to be using two different sets of software to run the calibration on our system, and you are correct there. The reason why you want to use the display manufacturer software when you have a hardware calibrated display is because their software is going to talk directly with the lookup table that's built into the display so that all the color adjustment is done at the panel level. What you're going to get is a much better color calibration when you use the device manufacturer software, or in this case, the screen manufacturer software. For our laptop, we would use our calibration device software. So in this case, because I'm using the X-Rite i1 Display Pro, what I'm going to use to calibrate my laptop here is i1 Profiler. If you have the X-Rite i1 Studio, you'll be using the i1 Studio software, or if you have a device by another manufacturer, you'll be using the software that comes with that device to calibrate your internal display and run a software calibration. Okay. So the first thing what I'm going to do here is calibrate my BenQ first. And the whole key thing about running calibration in these multiple displays is the first thing you have to note is that the colors will come close, but they'll never match exactly. And there's really no way to match them. Inherently, the reason why is because if you look at the display in general, look at the size of the display, look at the thickness of the panel. The technology that's built into these panels are inherently different. And because of that reason alone, trying to match these colors is going to be extremely difficult. Secondly, if there is any software that allows you to match, for example, the color in your laptop to what you see here, I would avoid using that. The reason why is because you're manipulating one output in order for it to match another output. And that's never a good scenario because you're no longer seeing true good colors because you are manipulating the profile. And running a software calibration on a non-hardware calibration device it's already bad enough already because the ICC profile that you're generating is manipulating the video output. Okay, let's move on here. So what I'm going to do here to calibrate the BenQ display is use BenQ software called Palette Master Element. I am going to call Palette Master Element up. Palette Master Element is going to automatically launch on the BenQ display. Note though that Palette Master Element will only work on BenQ SW displays. Now that we have Palette Master Element up, I am going to choose Advanced Mode. And part of the reason is because I want to go in and dial in a lot of settings so to make sure that I can control some of the parameters between my external hardware calibrated display and my internal software calibrated display. So I'm going to choose Profiling, click on Next, and in this screen under Display Setting, this is where we would come in and change a lot of the settings or keep them at default value for that matter. Starting out at the very top, we have white point. We're going to stick with D65 in this case. And then when we do the calibration on our laptop or any device with a built-in display that you may have standing in place of my laptop here, you'll be using D65 as the white point for that display also. Secondly, for the RGB primary for the BenQ display, I always recommend that if you can and if you can get a successful calibration, always try to use Panel Native because Panel Native is going to give you the largest color gamut possible that this display can produce. Next up is Illuminance. For luminance, the recommended range I recommend for anyone doing any color critical work on display, it's between 80 to 120 candela. This includes photographers that print, photographers that don't print, and also anybody doing video work. The reason why is you want to make sure that you set the standard brightness of your display regardless of whatever other displays out there and how bright or how dim they are set. You want to make sure that you're editing on a good luminance range. So in this case, because I want to choose the middle ground here, I'm going to choose the luminance of 100. Again, between 80 to 120 candela will work in this case. I'm choosing 100. Gamma, I'm going to leave that at default 2.2. And for this one, black point, I am going to choose relative. Black point is something that you can definitely go around and play with. You could run the calibration and see which one produces the better blacks to your desire. In this case, like I said, I'm going to choose relative. Click on next. This is a screen where you would come in and choose a calibration slot. A few things here that we need to note is that if you're on a Mac, most of the things that you have here can be left to default. If you're on a PC, however, make sure that you come in and change the profile to version 2 because you don't want the version 4 of the ICC profile to conflict with the operating system and cause weird colors to happen. Secondly, under profile type, in this case, if you're able to get 16-bit LUT to work and you're able to pass the validation, I would keep this a 16-bit LUT because this is going to provide the best result of any calibration. From there, what I would do is also select the patch size, and in this case, I am going to choose large. Now we're done with all these settings, click on Start Measurement. I'm not going to go through with the measurement on this one. I just want to walk you through this screen and how you would go in and set up Palette Master Element in a multiple display setup. Once you've calibrated this, Palette Master Element is automatically going to set the profile for this display and also the calibration slot. So you'll be set for this display. Now we have to move on to our laptop. Now on my laptop, the software that I'm going to use to calibrate my laptop display here is i1 Display Pro because I am using the i1 Display Pro Plus as I mentioned earlier. Once i1 Profiler recognizes the device, the first thing I'm going to do is choose to calibrate in advanced mode. The reason why is because I want to make sure that many of the settings that I have set up with Palette Master Element matches in i1 Profiler too. From there, come up to the very top part. Under Display, click on Profiling. We're going to be in this profiling screen, and what I'm going to do here is make sure that the i1 Profiler software is on the proper display. Whatever display the i1 Profiler is on, that is going to be the display that is going to calibrate. So in this case, I don't want my i1 Profiler software running on my external BenQ display. So you can do that by clicking on Color LCD like I just did, and it will center itself on the display that you're going to do the calibration on. You can change the backlit technology. In this case, I'm going to leave it at default. And you will start to see that many of the settings that are already in i1 Profiler, you can leave it at default value because they're going to match closely to what we have set up before. Number one, starting at the very top is white point. It is already set to D65, so we are set there. Second, luminance. It's already set to 100 candela, and part of the reason why is because I already run multiple calibrations on my laptop here and set it to that value. Yours may not open up to this value, but the best thing that you can do in this case to make sure that the luminance value that you have selected here matches closely with what you have set on BenQ Palette Master Element software. Next up is the gamma. I'm going to leave gamma at 2.2 here, and the rest I would just make sure that flare correction and ambient light smart control, both of those are unchecked. Contrast ratio, leave it at native. Moving on to the profile setting, or clicking on next, you're going to come up with the profile settings screen. For the profile settings screen, you can leave everything at default value by clicking on Use Default there. And the only thing to note here is that if you are a PC user, make sure that you come in and set the ICC version to 2 instead of version 4, again, so that it doesn't conflict with the operating system. Next up, what you would do is choose the amount of patch size that you have in the patch set. In this case, I am going to choose large. And we are now at the measurement screen. At the measurement screen here, what I'm going to do is make sure that automatic display control is unchecked and that adjust brightness, contrast, and RGB gain manually is checked. From there, I will click on Start Measurement. Again, I'm not going to go through the measurement here. I just want to walk you through some of the basic settings in order for these two devices to get a great calibration individually. Once you're done with the calibration, you're going to get an individual ICC profile for both of these displays, and that's a great thing because you want them to have its own individual color mapping on the ICC profile. The next thing that we need to talk about here is addressing one of the most important things and one of the most frequently asked questions I get is that these two displays are now going to look different. Well, they're going to come close to each other, but there are still going to be differences. I mentioned before some of the reasons why there would be differences, but again, one of the main things here, we're also talking about a color gamut between both of these displays that are different. So in this case, if I were you, what I would do is use my BenQ display as the primary color grading display. This is going to be a display that I do all my color critical work on, and I am going to use my built-in display, in this case my laptop display here, as a secondary display. I can have a web browser, so if I want to watch YouTube, including my channel, you can do that. Or you can have it show all the panels that you would use in Photoshop, or have music playing, whatever you decide that you want to do, this would be your secondary display. A couple of things here that I want to show you is talk about the color gamut a little bit, and part of the reason why I would use the SW271, this hardware calibrated display, as the primary display. So what I would do here is I'm going to go and pull up panel native calibration. This is what panel native looks like on the SW271. And what I'm going to do is hold this in place for comparison. So now we compare this relative to other ICC profiles. So I'm going to go and pull in Adobe RGB. We can see that in our panel native calibration, we are able to get a much larger color space than even Adobe RGB that you see there, noted by the outline. That's the panel native calibration on the SW271. Next up, what I want to do is pull the laptop ICC color profile up so that we can see. So for this laptop, I already gone in and calibrated, and we can see right away that they're both great profiles, but there's a big difference in the way how the color wedges are. So what's really going on here? When I show you Adobe RGB a moment ago, BenQ ICC profile looks much closer and much closer in shape to Adobe RGB rather than our laptop. Well, if you really think about it, my MacBook Pro here has been calibrated from the factory with DCI-P3 color space. It can do DCI-P3 really well. And what I'm going to show you here is, let's hold out the MacBook Pro ICC profile for comparison here. And I'm going to pull in DCI-P3. As we see there, MacBook Pro color matches really closely with DCI-P3. But here's the case though, DCI-P3 is a color space designed for digital cinema P3 color space. A little bit different than Display P3, but it's really designed for digital cinema, so movies and everything will look good, but it's not really the color space for photography. And that is primarily the reason why you want to run the calibration in panel native on your BenQ display and then use your BenQ SW hardware calibrated display as the primary display in this workflow. One more thing about the previous setup, and this is another frequent question that I receive, is that if I calibrate my laptop using i1 Profiler, and if I use i1 Profiler to also calibrate my hardware calibrated display, would that provide a result that's going to come closer to each other in terms of the profile that it generates? And the answer to that question is no, because inherently, again, you're talking about display with a different backlight technology. And secondly, because you have a hardware calibrated display, it is best to use the device manufacturer software because it will do all the adjustment at the panel level and access the LUT on the display directly. Some of you may notice a slightly different setup that I have here, and this is for scenario number 2. What I have here is my laptop, and again, I have an external display. However, this display that I have here is not capable of hardware calibration. The display that I'm using to do this demo here is BenQ PD3220U. This is their 32-inch 4K design display, and again, this display is not capable of hardware calibration. The software set that I'm going to use to calibrate both of these displays are going to be i1 Profiler, and primarily I'm using i1 Profiler here out of necessity because there is no other software that I would use to calibrate both of these displays together. Will the colors come close to each other? It's going to come close, but again, it won't necessarily match because of different panel technologies, different backlight technologies, and so forth. So there are some inherently hardware things that prevents it from matching entirely also. I am going to skip showing you the i1 Profiler setting on my laptop because I already showed you that in scenario 1. And what I'm going to do here is show you i1 Profiler setting on the external BenQ display here. So again, making sure that the device is already authenticated with i1 Profiler, choose advanced mode, come in under display and click on profiling. In the first screen here, what you want to make sure happens is that I1 profiler is showing up on the proper display. In this case, it is on my BenQ display, so I have it on the correct display. If it's not on the correct display, you can click on the display name and it will center itself on the proper display at that point. I'm going to leave backlight technology the same in this case, so this is white LED. And for the rest of the setting, in this case, because I already run the calibration earlier, they're all at default values for me. So for example, white point is already set to D65. Because I calibrated my laptop at D65, I want this to match. Secondly, the luminance level. In this case, I've chosen 100 candela, but again, a value between 80 to 120 candela will work in this case, again, for photographers, both print, non-print, and for video editors as well. Gamma, I'm going to leave that at 2.2, contrast ratio at native, and scroll down a little bit here, flare correction and ambient light smart control is unchecked. Click on next, and we're going to go through our workflow here. So in the profile setting, I'm going to leave everything at default, especially if I'm running on a Mac system. If I'm running on a Windows system, what I would do here is change the ICC profile version to version 2. Next up, what I would do is choose the amount of patch. I'm going to choose large in this case and go through the calibration. Click on next, and now we're at the measurement screen. In this case, what I would do is disable automatic display control and check adjust brightness, contrast, and RGB gain manually. This way, I can go in and manually adjust the brightness of the display so that it is within range and as close as possible to the value that I have set it to, which is 100 candela. From here, once the calibration is done, it is going to generate an ICC profile. What I would do in this case is make sure that you run the validation on this to do a display QA. And from that point, the program is automatically going to set the ICC profile from the display, so you'll be good on both of these systems. Now that the calibration is done, there are a few things that we need to discuss about these displays. Many of them are going to come with different color modes. So in this case, you want to make sure that you choose the best color mode that fits best with your workflow. But also in this case, what I would highly recommend that you do is also to consult your display manual. And part of the reason why is because certain manufacturers would do something different with different color modes. For instance, I know for a fact that in BenQ display here, this PD3220U, BenQ have calibrated two different color modes here. In this case, display P3 and sRGB for greater uniformity. And when I talk about uniformity here, I'm talking about the evenness across the entire panel. I've run a testing on that, and I can verify that display P3 and sRGB are the two best color modes for uniformity on this panel. And specifically, what I want to do for this display, when I calibrate it, I want to make sure that I set the color mode to display P3 before I run any calibration. This way I can get the largest color space possible out of this panel. So that's just something to keep in mind. So lastly, what I want to talk about is which display should you then use in this type of setup as your primary color grading or color workflow display. So what I'm going to do first is pull up the ICC profile from my Mac laptop, and what I'm going to do is hold that for comparison. And what I'm going to do next is compare this to the BenQ PD3220U calibrated with display P3 at luminance 100. So let's go and pull that in. What we can see there right away is that the BenQ color profile is a little bit smaller, slightly smaller than what I have achieved from my internal built-in MacBook Pro. In this case, what I would do though, because they're so close to each other, what I would still do is use my BenQ external display as the primary color grading display here, because number one, the size is much larger. It has a much more stable backlight in this case. And generally the reason why you would get these displays so that you have more real estate to work on your files. Something to keep in mind though is that if you have an older external display that you are hooking up to your laptop, and if you run the calibration and the color profile is going to be much smaller than what you can achieve with your laptop. In that case, what I might do is run the laptop as a primary display, and for the secondary display there, I would use it as a panel display or a browser, whatever that may be. So in that situation, in those rare instances, I would do it that way. But otherwise, if you just got a new panel here, what I would do is use, for example, like this BenQ as my primary external display. So in this third scenario here, in order to do a demo, I've gone a little bit crazy on the display. So I have my laptop display here. I have an external display, in this case, the SW271 that I've used earlier. This is a hardware calibrated display, and also the PD3220U. This is a design display that is only capable of software calibration. So when you have the display running in a multiple display format like this, how would you then go and calibrate it? Very similar to scenario number 1 and 2 that I've shown you before. In this case, the displays that are not capable of hardware calibration, I would use i1 Profiler to run a calibration on each of them. And for the hardware calibrated display, what I would do here is use the display manufacturer software, in this case Palette Master Element, to run the calibration. Again, keeping in mind that you should make sure that the white point, the gamma, the luminance are all within the same range, and in this case you're going to get a pretty good setup. So in a multiple display setup such as this, if you have a hardware calibrated display in those setup, what I would do is use the hardware calibrated display as the primary reference display in this case, because with all the hardware calibrated display, the color adjustment is done at the panel level. This way you're going to get the truest, best accurate colors from a hardware calibrated display. Now, the next thing that I want to do here is talk about what happened if I take my laptop out of this equation, and let's say that this is just a desktop environment. I'm not going to pull a laptop out here, but just imagine this with me. In those scenarios, if you're using a mixed display like this, again, I would use the individual software, for example, Palette Master Element to calibrate the hardware calibrated display, and i1 Profiler to calibrate the software calibrated display in this case. But what happens if you're running on an environment where you just have hardware calibrated displays? So in that case, pick any one of those displays to be your primary reference display. All of those will be able to show true, good, accurate colors. What I might want to do in this case is making sure that I pick the newest displays, because generally the LED backlight and everything are newer and you're going to get a better result that way. If you're running on a desktop environment and you have only software calibrated display linked up to it, like for example, multiple of these external display like this BenQ Designer display, what I would do in this case is run the calibration on them, and what I would then do is test and audit in terms of which display will show you the best color, especially if you're running multiple different display models, display manufacturer, whatever that may be, and also display age. Those are situations where you would need to take some more time to run some tests and give it some more thoughts and consideration before you can choose which display is going to be your primary display in that case. Unlike all of my calibration videos before, my recommendation is to leave these display running for at least about 15 minutes. This way the backlight has an opportunity to warm up and stabilize before you run the calibration so that you can get the best calibration possible. Secondly, there are certain settings that you need to disable on both Mac and PC before you run a calibration, and this is for desktop and laptop. It doesn't really matter. What I'm going to do in this case is put those videos in the description below so you can check those videos out too and make sure that you turn those settings off before you run the calibration on your system. And lastly, I'll put links to all these individual videos on how to calibrate these individual devices in the description below as well. So anyway, I hope that you find this guide on how to calibrate these displays in a multiple display environment like this helpful. If you have any questions about this, leave them in the comment section below. Give this video a like if you find it helpful. Subscribe to my channel if you're new. Hit on the notification bell to be updated when I upload cool new videos like this. And until next time, art is right.